Welcome to Power Talks with Santosha. Today we have with us Ms. Daisy Dell, the representative of UNHCR to Nepal. At any given time, one or other part of the world is facing humanitarian crisis due to conflict, civil war, military attacks, or natural disasters of several kinds. Whatever it is, a large number of populations are displaced or forced to migrate from their homelands and seek refuge somewhere else. UNHCR played an instrumental role in Sri Lanka's recovery from tsunami disaster. Post Sri Lanka's war against LTTE, how is UNHCR preparing to help the large number of internally displaced civilians?
Indeed, you're right that UNHCR contributed to the recovery after the tsunami, but UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, has been in Sri Lanka since a long time. We opened an office there in the late 80s, and we've been helping with displaced populations ever since. And the most recent displacement that we've been witnessing, UNHCR has been helping the government in actually assisting the refugees, the displaced populations, in some 40 sites, I think all over northern and eastern Sri Lanka, and it's about 300,000 people that are there. The main focus of our work has been in trying to enlarge the place where the people are, sort of having more land available, decongest the places, providing assistance, and also focusing on the most vulnerable people, the women, the children, those that got separated during the flight from their families, making sure that these people sort of are reunited. And we're working with the government now on more freedom of movement. We hope that these people will be able to return very quickly to their initial villages, and we'll be working with the communities to rebuild the houses and make sure that the communities can return to where they come from.
In a similar fashion, Pakistan government had to deal strongly against the Taliban terrorists who occupied Swat Valley. And as a result, Swat Valley's migration is the largest one after the 1947 partition. Is there any plan for UNHCR to take the supports to Swat Valley as well?
UNHCR has been very active in Pakistan for many years because, as you know, there's been a large population of Afghan refugees, but more recently with the earthquake, UNHCR has been helping the government. And we've now witnessed one of the greatest population displacements of modern times, as you've said. There's about 2 million people now who are displaced within Pakistan. Pakistan is displaced within Pakistan. It's about 1.5 million of the recent displacement and 500,000 of earlier displacement already some months back. So about 2 million people in need of assistance. And over 160,000 people are now living in camps, while the rest are staying with host families, with friends, or in public buildings, in schools, in different locations. But this population is increasing every day because those who've initially helped them, sort of by giving them shelter in their homes, cannot sustain that either because they themselves are affected. So UNHCR has been very active in trying to work with the government. We have had a presence there for a long time, as I've said, with a big presence. But it is very difficult also, the situation, because it's such a large movement that has happened in such a short time to address all of the needs of these people. The climate's not helping. It's extremely hot, so people who are staying in camps, we need to address, so their needs for water, additional water, but also shade, sort of some privacy. And we have brought in a lot of new UNHCR staff to help. We work with partners, with other UN agencies. There's also a security element. As you may know, the UNHCR head of office of Quetta was abducted at the beginning of the year in January and released in April. And we unfortunately have lost a colleague from the emergency team in the blast that happened at the hotel in Peshawar on Tuesday night. So security itself kind of makes it at times very difficult for us to deploy as many staff as we would need. Resources is obviously another issue, and we are sort of appealing for funds, to deal with this massive displacement. The High Commissioner himself came to Pakistan mid-May to look at the situation and to raise awareness and to raise funds.
Recently, UNHCR succeeded in distributing some 110,000 identity cards to Sudanese refugees in Chad. It took Darfur a long time to receive global attention and then the humanitarian aid. Why did it take such a long time in Darfur's case?
You're right. There is ongoing distribution of identity cards to the refugees, the Sudanese refugees in Chad. UNHCR is assisting those people and protecting them in refugee camps. It is much more complicated inside Darfur, because inside Darfur, these people are not refugees. They have not crossed the border yet, so their status, or they haven't crossed the border, maybe they will not, their status is not refugees. Their status is internally displaced. And the Sudanese government did not recognize that UNHCR had a role to play with these people. They consider they come under the protection of the Sudanese government. But UNHCR has been able to find a way to work in Darfur together with other agencies, because we have some refugee camps there of Chadian refugees who've crossed the border into Sudan. And looking after these refugees, we've been able to open offices and provide assistance to an increasing number of internally displaced, as these people are called. Unfortunately, developments as of late have not been very favorable, because, as you know, Sudan has asked a lot of international organizations, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, to leave the country. And they were partners of UNHCR. They were helping us to provide assistance to these populations. And now there's much more of a skeleton staff that's left behind, and it's much more difficult to do the implementation of assistance. We have 5 full-fledged offices in Darfur and 2 presences as well. But it is more difficult, and a lot of the women and children in particular sort of are living in very, very difficult, very fragile conditions, and we are not reaching them, and it's very difficult for us to address their needs.
In South Asia, especially in Nepal and in India, the issue of Tibetan refugee is a significant one. How has UNHCR recognized the status of Tibetan refugees?
UNHCR does recognize that Tibetan refugees may be in need of international protection. Most Tibetan refugees have found protection either in India or in Nepal, and those governments do recognize some of their rights. Nepal is hosting some 20,000 Tibetan refugees, and all of those who have arrived here before the cutoff date of 1989 have actually been recognized officially by the government as refugees. In India, India continues to give status to the Tibetan refugees and recognizes their right, so UNHCR only intervenes in those cases where people have not found protection.
During the Taliban regime, Afghans took refuge in Pakistan and India and other parts of the world. Now that Afghanistan has a better socio-economic and political environment, has there been any success story?
The Afghan refugee population has been one of the largest in the world. In the late 90s, there were some 5 million Afghan refugees, mainly in Pakistan and in Iran. And since 2002, over 4 million have returned with the assistance of UNHCR back to Afghanistan.
That's a great success story.
It's a great success story, but it does remain quite fragile, because many people do get reintegration assistance when they come back, and that helps them. But in order to kind of rebuild their lives, they need more assistance than that. And Afghanistan still needs a lot of support from the international community. Repatriation is voluntary, so only those who wish to go are going back. Return must be voluntary. It's important that people have a free choice. Pakistan has just extended the deadline for Afghan refugees to stay in Pakistan from 2009 to 2012 to give people the opportunity to choose that. It is a very large population movement. I mean, it added to the 2 million Pakistanis that are now displaced and 1.7 million Afghans. It's a large population movement. UNHCR is helping all these displaced populations with the government, and we have been doing so in the past. We've been helping local hosting populations that have been hosting the refugees. We've been helping during the earthquake, and we will continue to help, considering the conditions, and as difficult as they are, to reach the refugees and the displaced persons in need.
We'll continue with our conversation after a short break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Power Talks. We are in conversation with Ms. Daisy Dell, the representative of UNHCR to Nepal. How do we differentiate between the displaced population and those who are termed to be a refugee?
The words displaced people and refugees are often used interchangeably by the public and by the media, but there is a difference. Refugees are defined in an international convention, the 1951 Refugee Convention, and refugees are people who've left their country, which means they're outside their country, for reasons of persecution, human rights violations, serious human rights violations, for reasons of political opinions, race, ethnicity, religion, etc. So it's a clearly defined definition. Displaced persons can cover these people, but it can also cover other notions. It can cover internally displaced, which means people who may also have, for human rights violations, been displaced within their country and not crossed over border. And it can also be economic displacement, like migrant workers who are going abroad.
Whenever there is a civil war, whenever there is a conflict of any kind, It's clear that people will be displaced, people will migrate out, refugees will be created. In that context, why does not UN have a mechanism of pre-preparedness?
I mean, there's obviously the political level and the humanitarian level. The political level works between government with government, so I will speak about the humanitarian level. At the humanitarian level, there's a lot of contingency planning, preparedness planning, and so on that is ongoing at the level of the UN together with the governments. OCHA, the Office of the Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs, takes the lead in this, but each agency is also very active. UNHCR has a whole section that is emergency preparedness, that trains people to intervene in emergency situations like the one that has just gone, the teams that have just gone to Pakistan. They do contingency planning with governments, way ahead of a crisis that could happen in order to prepare everybody to plan for such a crisis and to intervene, and that is very helpful.
Is there any specific focus on women and children?
Indeed, women and children are very often the ones who are most impacted by such disasters when they have to flee with very little and find themselves often without the man in situations where they're not protected. And efforts are being made by UNHCR but also by others to, as quickly as possible, make sure that special systems are set up for single-headed households, for women, to address issues of sexual and gender-based violence, to protect children who may have been separated from their families, and to look after separated children, unaccompanied children, trace their parents, and a lot of measures are taken now to make sure that these issues don't come in the end. There was a time where food and shelter seemed to be the first necessity, but I think now you will see in emergency preparedness and in emergency response that major efforts are sort of undertaken to make sure that the people are not looked at as a group of people who fled, but as a group of people with specific needs, and these specific needs need to be addressed.
Is lack of fund often the constraint?
Indeed, lack of fund can be a constraint, especially for forgotten crises, people who've stayed in camps for many years, like to some extent the Bhutanese here in Nepal, but also other caseloads in Bangladesh, in Thailand, and so on. Sometimes funding comes difficult after many years. In an emergency situation, it's easier to raise funds, even though when it's a mega emergency, it can be difficult to get the funds at the right time to kind of really be able to deal with the emergency. But situations that linger on for many years, that become protected situations, it gets very difficult after a while to raise funds, and then it's very difficult to implement the programs. And it is obvious also that in the context of the global financial crisis that we're now witnessing, that it's going to get more and more difficult to raise funds for humanitarian situations. The funds that UNHCR receives are voluntary funds for the largest extent, so governments don't have assessed contributions, but they voluntarily contribute to the organization, and with the needs at home it may get more difficult to raise those funds for humanitarian assistance.
Most of the refugee camps are oddly placed, and in a country like Nepal, which is rich in natural resources with water, we still face water deficit and electricity crisis. How do you reach to the refugee camps with water supplies?
The camps are managed in a comprehensive manner. UNHCR works together with the government to set up the different services, so it's water, sanitation, but it's also provision of health, provision of education. We work closely with the government, and we sign agreements with partners, with national and international NGOs, who actually work on those various aspects and make sure that people are provided the basic services. So water is provided in the camps. We also try to address the needs of the surrounding populations at times. We have an example in Damak in the Baldangi camps, where we have now a project that also looks after the water and sanitation needs of the local population, the hosting population that lives in the vicinity, to make sure that they benefit from the same thing. But normally UNHCR, together with its partners, addresses all of those issues within the camp.
The issue of refugee is generally an outcome of political failure and are politically charged. How does UNHCR balance out the political component while dealing with refugees?
UNHCR is a non-political organization. But UNHCR works with the consequences of political turmoil very often, and UNHCR works very closely with the governments in providing assistance and protection to refugees. Like we've been working with the Nepal authorities for the last 18 years to provide assistance and protection to the Bhutanese refugees here. The solutions for refugee crisis also lie with the governments. Sort of in the case of the Bhutanese refugees, they lie with Bhutan, they lie with the government of Nepal, and they lie with governments of third countries that may accept as refugees, but also that are funding the assistance that is being provided to the refugees here. So even though we're non-political, we're very much, dependent on the relationships with the different governments and the decisions that they make in relation to the refugees and the global solutions for the refugees. And in this context, we are hoping very much that, in addition to their resettlement, one day return to Bhutan will become a possibility.
We'll continue with our conversation after a short break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Power Talks. We are in conversation with Ms. Daisy Dell, the representative of UNHCR to Nepal. During the Maoist insurgency, we had huge population internally displaced. Like in Sri Lanka and in Pakistan, we have lots of Nepalese refugees within Nepal. Has UNHCR looked into this aspect?
Indeed, you have a large number of people who were displaced by those conflict, the conflict here in the country. And UNHCR, together with OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and OCHA, has put together a unit that was looking into those issues. The difference here is that the people who were displaced internally did not end up in camps like in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. So it was much more difficult to identify them, to register them. And it was found that very often their needs were very similar to the populations who had not been displaced but were also affected by the conflict. But there was quite a bit of lobbying going on with the government at the central level and at the local level to actually sort of make sure that the rights of these people were respected. Some guidelines were on IDPs, on internally displaced persons, were adopted by the government. Unfortunately, the directives that would operationalize them are still not adopted at this point. And it seems that many of the persons who were displaced have returned voluntarily to their locations if they wanted to. Others have decided to stay in those locations where they are. These people are not strictly sense of refugees. I mean, they're called refugees, but they haven't crossed the borders. We wouldn't qualify them legally as refugees. But they're persons who've been displaced, and the UN is aware of that. There's a lot more that has to be done for people who've been internally displaced, and a lot has been done over the last years to kind of address that in a much more comprehensive way. Nepal, in a way, was a pilot in many regards, in dealing with those issues.
During the decade-long civil war, about 6 million Nepalese moved to India. Since we have open work permit and visa-free relations with India, most of them are working or studying there. But in case someone has to apply for the status of a refugee, can they qualify?
Many Nepalis actually went abroad during the war, and many of those went to India. In India, they have found protection because the Indian authorities, the Indian government respects the rights of Nepalis there. They're allowed to work, they're allowed to study, they have a right to stay. So most of these people did not apply for refugee status because they don't need it. They have found protection in India. But those that moved further afield sometimes have approached UNHCR to ask for protection. Some may have left here as migrant workers because that's the visas that they got, and then they would approach our office in Hong Kong, in Bangkok, or elsewhere to ask for refugee status. It was then determined there's a procedure, where we see whether this person meets the refugee criteria or not. And some were found to be refugees, and some have actually now, after the war is over, asked UNHCR to help them repatriate to Nepal. They voluntarily want to come back, and we have been helping people. We've been assisting people to come back. It's small numbers, but we've been helping.
Since early 1990s, the issue of Bhutanese refugee has been a major focus for Nepal. Has the current offer of third country settlement proved to be an effective solution?
The refugees from Bhutan arrived in Nepal in the early 90s and have been living in camps in the area of Damak for 17, 18 years with very little hope. I mean, so the whole generation has been born in those camps. We're very grateful to the government of Nepal for hosting these refugees when they were in need of protection and for letting UNHCR protect and assist these people. But it's been very difficult, especially for young people who grow up there and don't really see a hope for the future. Unfortunately, the 15 rounds of bilateral talks between the government of Bhutan and the government of Nepal have not led to any major breakthrough, and so far not a single person has been able to go back to Bhutan. So there was 3-4 years ago a core group of donor governments that kind of came together around the resettlement issue and was trying to find a solution to this protracted situation. And they made resettlement offers for Bhutanese refugees to go to third countries. The core group has some of the major countries, major donors to UNHCR, and also major resettlement countries. It's the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and then in Europe, Denmark, Netherlands, and Norway. These countries agreed with the government of Nepal, and Nepal finally agreed to accept third country resettlement. So the option of third country resettlement became realistic after the government of Nepal accepted this in November 2007. And as of March 2008, people have been leaving for third country resettlement. They can apply, and we have almost 70,000 people who've come forward now to declare their interest for third country resettlement. About 14,500 have already left. And the feedback that we get from resettlement countries is quite positive. I mean, these people adjust well, they integrate well, they're educated well, and they manage really quite well. They kind of, after so many years of assistance, are quite capable of taking their lives into their own hands and moving ahead. Some are here who may not want to go, and we very much hope that there will be possibilities for these people to return to Bhutan, that Bhutan will accept to that some of these people go back, in particular elder people who really wish to go back to Bhutan, live there, and die in Bhutan. So our hope is that that may be a possibility. The international community continues to discuss with Bhutan and asking Bhutan to actually open up to this opportunity. But there may also be some people who may just want to stay here because culturally, language-wise and so on, they feel quite comfortable here and they may want to stay and maybe should be given a chance to stay here.
Recently, we have also noticed the presence of some 300 urban refugees in Kathmandu, especially from some parts of Africa and Asia. The government of Nepal has not accredited them yet. Do they hold any status with the UNHCR?
There are currently, indeed, 300 people here, some 300 people here, and the majority of them are either from Pakistan or from Somalia. Both countries have some political turmoil right now, which makes it difficult for these people to go back. In particular, the Somalis come from the Mogadishu region, and as you've been following, when there's been, new surge of violence, so even though some may want to go back, it's not possible at this stage. UNHCR assists these people financially and does recognize them as refugees. The government does not have legislation to recognize people as refugees and has not signed international conventions, but accepts the decision by UNHCR. So these people are allowed to stay, they're not deported, but they are not given the right to work, the right to stay legally here and so on. We're working with this population sort of on their stay here. Some, very few, may eventually be eligible for third country resettlement, and the others may probably have to remain in Nepal pending that there's an improvement of the situation in their countries and that they can go back home.
On 20th June, we are all celebrating the World Refugee Day. What is the message for 2009?
World Refugee Day is an annual event that's to commemorate the plight of refugees worldwide and to pay tribute to their courage. Here in Nepal, we're going to have a number of events with the refugees in Damac, in the camps, around the camps with the populations, but also in Kathmandu. And we will have a big exhibition that will be open to the public for a week as well. The message for this year's World Refugee Day is refugees are people like you and me with very real needs.
Let us hope that the message of World Refugee Day is received well the world over and UNHCR comes out with more successful stories next year.